This presentation will cover the life and ideas of Gorgias of Leontini, who was born around 483 BC to about 376 BC. You'll see that's quite a bit of time to be alive, and our records that we have of his life tell us that Gorgias did live to be well over 100 years old. Some records say as high as 110, some say 109, some say 105. But however long he lived a good long while, and all records I'm aware of agree that he lived to be well over 100 years old. When he was asked the secret of his longevity, he said that he never did anything for the sake of his belly. In other words, he never lived a gluttonous or self-indulgent life. Other people, commenting on the life of Gorgias, said that he was a wealthy man. For one thing, he lived pretty well in terms of how much he made. He never lived any one place long enough to have to be a homeowner and so be liable to taxation. And he did not have the burden of managing a wife and children. And so this freed up his resources and freed him to live more or less as he chose. Gorgias was also known for charging quite a bit of money for his courses in rhetoric. According to one record, he chose as much as 110 minae for his services. The course could last perhaps a year, maybe even longer. And the tuition for this, 110 minae, was 25 times the annual salary of a skilled worker. So of course only very wealthy people could afford to take the courses from Gorgias. He's a remarkable figure for not only because he lived so long, not only because he made so much money for his courses, but also because he leaves us a model of someone who believed very much and who lived his life believing in the pleasures and the powers of rhetoric. He is suggested by some to have been perhaps the first sophist. This is questionable, but the sophists were a loosely associated group of professors who would travel from place to place, charge a lot of money for their instruction, and in some taught their students to do basically two things. First was to be able to make very powerful, very persuasive arguments, and two, to live a virtuous life. And what that meant was to live the life of good and upstanding citizens, or at least to convince others that they did. There is some dispute over whether Gorgias himself professed to teach virtue in this way, as in the manner of another sophist named Protagoras. But in the Socratic dialogue we have, in which Gorgias appears as a fictionalized character, he does profess to teach justice and the difference between justice and injustice to his students, and so in this way to give them ethical instruction. Let's consider a little bit about him. This is a picture of what Gorgias looked like perhaps in his younger life. We do know that there was a statue erected to his honor. Some have suggested it was erected by Gorgias himself. As we have already considered, he probably had the money to do that, given the price he charged for his courses. This statue was erected at Delphi, or Delphi, where the famous oracle resided, and it seems to be beyond dispute that Gorgias was something of a legend in his own time. he certainly made quite the name for himself. Now, his major works, there are three I will mention and two we'll consider in some detail. The first is called On Non-Being or On Non-Existence. In this remarkable speech, which we have only in an outlined form in a couple of different versions, but even reading this is very impressive, Gorgias argues that nothing exists. He considers all of the reasons and the alternatives for whether we can know that something exists or whether nothing exists. And through a remarkable and even brilliant demonstration of logical reasoning, he shows that nothing exists. And then he says, well, if you can't accept that, nothing at least can be known. Nothing is knowable. And he says, if you can't be brought to accept that conclusion, at least we can say that nothing can be communicated from one person to another. This speech, which we are not reading, is available online, and I would suggest you reading it and reading it carefully. It isn't that long, but it will take some special attention to follow the arguments, and it's quite impressive as a feat of reasoning. The second, his most famous speech, is the encomium of Helen, sometimes called the encomium to Helen. We will consider this in some detail. We have assigned this. This illustrates how one can use argument to reason for the unlikely conclusion or the unpopular view. We'll consider it in some more detail and we'll see why it's remarkable. And third, we will consider in some small detail the defense of Palamedes, which was another of the speeches of Gorgias in which he shows what rhetoric is capable of doing. And we'll see what that is like in a few moments. Gorgias was not a man all by himself. He did have students. He was known for having been the teacher of Meno, a famous figure who appears in one of Socrates' dialogues. Agathon, Isocrates, not to be confused with Socrates. Isocrates was another famous sophist, but who disagreed with other sophists about whether virtue could be taught. Aspasia, who was a woman rhetorician, is believed to have been possibly one of Gorgias' students, and a student by the name of Proxenus, who was so enamored and enraptured by the lessons he took from Gorgias that he believed he could do anything. He went off and attempted to join the military and become a general because he believed that thanks to Gorgias he could win the hearts and minds of many men and command them. Where does Gorgias come from? Well, he comes from that little place in Sicily, that island just off the coast of Italy, the toe part of the boot that is Italy. He comes from that little place, and in 427 he traveled to Athens as an ambassador to plead for assistance of the Athenian people because Leontini was under attack by Syracuse. Once he traveled to Athens, he gave very moving speeches, and thus his reputation began to spread far and wide. He was sent as an ambassador to Athens because of his already locally famous abilities to speak, but now in Athens his reputation began to grow, and he would travel to Athens frequently throughout the rest of his life. He died in Thessaly. How did Gorgias get his start? Well, according to one story, Gorgias had a rival whose name was Prodigus. He was another one of the sophists. He also appears in some of the dialogues of Socrates. And Prodigus would tell a story about Hercules at the beginning of his career, in which he was met by two women at a crossroads. These two women told him that he could take one path or the other. To our left in this picture we have Virtue, who points Hercules one way, who promises him a hard and very difficult road and a way uphill. You can see in the background there the pains that await Hercules if he goes that way, but Virtue promises him much honor with the gods. On the other hand, to the right is Vice, and Vice is represented as a woman who offers Hercules all of the pleasures of the world, and together with an idle existence. You can see the beautiful fountain flowing free to the right, and also the theater, the stage, is noted on the bottom right hand of the picture. So Hercules chooses one or the other, and it was this story that Prodigus told time and time again, over and over, for the fee as he would go from place to place. When Gorgias witnessed a display of Prodigus, he was not impressed at all, and he mocked Prodigus and said that he could do better than that. And Gorgias, firmly convinced of his own powers of persuasion, would go about place to place, not doing the same speech over and over again, but in order to impress those in the audience, he would say this to them: propose anything you please. Give me any topic you like, and I will speak on it. And so audience members would tell him what to talk about, and he would do it right there on the spot in extemporaneous speech. We see some of this part of Gorgias's modus operandi in the Platonic dialogue, Gorgias, where he says that anyone can ask him any question that they like, and he will answer it for them, and he says with great confidence that there's nothing I haven't heard before. And so this is how Gorgias would make his reputation known. Now we begin with the encomium to Helen. Here's Helen of Troy. She famously leaves with Alexander, or Paris, goes with him to Troy. She leaves her husband Menelaus, and this act of inhospitality on Paris's part to take another man's wife, this act of adultery and gross immorality, as Christopher Marlowe would later phrase it in his play Dr. Faustus, hers was the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium. In other words, the tall towers of Troy were burned to the ground, and 1,000 ships were launched to get her back. She started the Trojan War. Many noble Greeks, many noble Trojans died in this conflict over her. She was a villain of the highest order in Greek mythology. And what Gorgias proposes to do is to show a speech in which he praises her and not condemns her, thereby taking on the popular opinion, everything that everybody knows, turn it on its head and argues why it would be incorrect. In our next video, we'll consider this speech in more detail.